Lesson 26, trinomial factoring and overlapping right triangles. The first thing we're going to talk about is trinomial factoring. Right? That's when we take a trinomial, which is a three-term equation, and we factor it down into two binomials. So two separate quantities that have two terms each. All right, so a couple of rules when we have trinomial factoring. In a trinomial, the first term is a product of the first terms of the binomial. The last term is the product of the last terms of the binomial. And the coefficient of the middle term is the sum of the last terms of the binomial. All right, for example, we have a trinomial function. All right, and we're breaking it down into two binomials. All right, so we're going backwards. Instead of distributing to multiply, we're going to go backwards. Now, the first term in the trinomial, so this x squared, is the product of the first terms of the binomials. So what times what can give me x squared? That's x times x. Now we know the last term is the product of the last terms of the binomial. So 6 is the product of whatever goes in the last places of the binomial. So we're looking for multiples of 6. Now, the multiples of 6, we have 1 and 6, and 2 and 3. Now before we pick a pair of multiples, the coefficient of the middle term, so this 5, is the sum of the last terms. Alright? So we're either adding or subtracting 1 and 6, or we're adding and subtracting 2 and 3. Now, 6 minus 1 is 5. 2 plus 3 is 5, so we can use either pair. What is going to happen is we're going to determine which pair we use by what sign is in our binomial. When the last sign is positive and the middle sign is negative, both signs are negative. So what two numbers can I have that they're both negative and they multiply to give me 6 and add and subtract to give me 5? That would be 2 and 3. Negative 2 times negative 3 is positive 6. Negative 2 plus negative 3 is negative 5. All right, so we factored our trinomial down to two binomials. That's what we're doing in this lesson. Now let's make sure that it checks. The first term of the binomial, or the trinomial, is a product of the first terms of the binomial. So x times x gives me x squared. That one is true. The last term is the product of the last terms of the binomial. So we have negative 2 times negative 3, that gives me positive 6. That again is true. Then the coefficient of the middle term, negative 5, is the sum of the last terms. So negative 2 plus negative 3, which is negative 5. That is correct. All right, so we have factored that binomial. Let's take a look at a couple other examples. All right, the next one we have is x squared minus 5x minus 14. All right, we want to factor this one down into two binomials. All right, we know that the first term in each binomial is going to be x because we have to have x times x to give me x squared. Now, if we look at our signs, the last term is negative and the middle term is negative. That means one's going to be minus and one's going to be plus. If the last term is negative, then you're going to have opposite signs in your middle term. Now, we need to know what factors of 14 14 will multiply to give us 14, but add or subtract to give me 5. All right, so factors of 14, we have 1 and 14, 2 and 7. 2 and 7 multiply to give me 14, but add or subtract to give me 5. Okay, so now we need to put them in the right places. We have minus 5 in the top, which means our bigger number needs to be minus. And we're going to have plus 2. Negative 7 plus 2 is negative 5. Negative 7 times positive 2 is negative 14. All right, we have factored the trinomial into two binomials. Let's try another one. We have x squared, 3x squared minus 6x plus 24, minus 24, excuse me. All right, now notice, we don't have just a plain coefficient of 1 in the front. We have a coefficient of 3. But you will also notice from the lesson before when we did monomial factoring that we can factor a 3 out. All right, so if we factor 3 from each term, we're left with x squared minus 2x minus 8. All right, and now we can factor the x squared minus 2x minus 8 into two binomials, keeping that 3 out in front. All right, so what times what gives me x squared? Well, that's x times x. All right, my last term is negative, which means I'm going to have a negative term and a positive term in my two binomials. Now, factors of 8 that will add or subtract to give me 2. All right, let's factors of 8. We've got 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. So factors of 8 that will multiply to give me 8 but add or subtract to give me 2 are 2 and 4. Because our middle term is negative, we always want to choose the bigger number to go with our middle term. So we're going to do 4, it's going to be negative. That way I'll end up with a negative middle. And the 2 is going to be positive. Now go ahead and try this one on your own. Right, we have 2x to the 4th minus 12x cubed minus 32x squared. Keep in mind that on some of these you may have to do some monomial factoring before you can factor down into two binomials. All right, so go ahead and try that one on your own, and we will come back and check it in class. Hit pause as you do the problem and hit play when you're ready to move on. All right, the next thing that we're talking about is overlapping triangles. All right, we've done overlapping triangles in lessons past. The first thing that we need to remember in doing overlapping triangles is to write the triangles separately. So we're going to draw these out separately before we can make our proportions. All right, so let's do the big triangle first. The big triangle's long side is, or right side is C. The bottom side is 6 plus 4, which will give me 10. And the hypotenuse is A plus B. Right? Now the long side of the small triangle, which is this one right here, it's not written in, but it is 4. All right, long side of the small triangle is 6, and the hypotenuse is A. All right, so now we want to set up some proportions to solve for the missing side. All right, so we know that 6 is to 10. We're going small triangle to big triangle. We know that 4 is to C. All right, so there's one proportion in which we can solve for side C. All right, so to solve for C, would cross multiply. 6 times C equals 4 times 10, which is 40, which means that C equals 46, or 20/3. All right, so we've solved for side C. And our other proportion is going to be A over A plus B. Now, we need to know what at least one of those values is. Notice in this small triangle, we can solve for the missing side by doing the Pythagorean theorem. All right, so if we do Pythagorean theorem, we have 6 squared plus 4 squared gives me side A. 6 squared is 36. 4 squared is 16. 36 plus 16 is 52. So side A is going to be the square root of 52. All right, we can plug that into our proportion. So now we have the square root of 52 over the square root of 52 plus B. right? We took this proportion here, and we plugged in square root of 52 for A. Now we're going to set it equal to one of the sides that we already know. We're going to use our known sides. We know that 6 is to 10. All right, so now we've got a proportion. We can cross multiply and solve for B. All right, so on your own, go ahead and finish this problem by cross multiplying and solving for B. And we will check it when you come back into